Okay, hello. So I recorded this initially, and whenever I did, I didn't have my mic on. I didn't really talk or anything, but I did show my build at the end of this, just to kind of highlight all the different pieces. This is a tier 35 dungeon.
Not while I'm in town.
And this is the Shadow Blight and Blood Orb based necro build that I kind of showed off in another video. I did make one change since that build guide. I traded out my helmet. The aspect that I had on my helmet before was a more damage-oriented aspect, and I recognized that the main downside of this build is that you're most squishy at the very beginning of a fight, before you're able to generate the corpses and suck up the blood orbs to get your fortify going and your barrier going. Before that, that's when you're most likely to die. So what I did was I put on the aspect that creates a bubble around you, that makes you immune while you're inside it for 5 seconds. And that gives you plenty of time to get your layers of damage mitigation online at the beginning of the fight. And then you can just maintain them throughout the fight. Also, throughout this video, you'll kind of see me play in a different style than I usually do on this build. Normally what I'll do is I'll just stand in the middle of the enemies and suck them all towards me. I've got the passive node that is damage mitigation to close enemies and more damage to close enemies, and I think I might also have just a little bit of damage to close enemies on my ear. You saw the bubble go off there. That gives me plenty of time to generate and suck up my blood orbs to get my fortify and my barrier going. But anyways, yeah, so the normal way that I play is sort of more in melee range. The reason I'm playing in a more ranged playstyle in this dungeon is because one of the affixes on this dungeon was that mobs take less damage when you close them. So they take less damage in melee range. So to maximize my damage, I was kind of playing more of a spellcaster way of just like, get in, get my damage going, and then step back. It's not that I'm outrageously squishy, it's just that I was trying to maximize my damage. Now, this build is actually super tanky. In fact, a lot of the time, once you get that barrier up, it becomes kind of a race between how fast you take damage and how fast you can suck up the blood orbs, and the blood orbs always win. Because what you're doing is you're standing in the middle of a crowd of enemies. You're spawning tons of corpses, and you're immediately using those corpses, which also spawns blood orbs, like right on top of you, and you instantly suck them up as they're generated. So you keep your barrier up all the time. You can see that poison damage that happens just there. If I was standing in the middle of those enemies, where I immediately got the blood orbs as they were being created, that poison damage wouldn't have mattered at all. I would have easily out-healed it. And you can kind of see the playstyle here. I run in and I pull all the monsters together. I apply vulnerability to them. If there's not a corpse already by that point, then I'll use Reap once to spawn one guaranteed corpse, and then just chain corpse explosion until they're all dead. If the vulnerability wears off and I need to reapply it, particularly against elites, then I'll use the corpse tendrils to reapply vulnerability. That's really the only time you'll see me use corpse tendrils. Most of the time I just use the bone prism, and by the time I need it again, it's off cooldown. Technically, I can use Blood Mist to generate corpses at the start, but that puts my escapability on cooldown, and it is guaranteed corpses, but it's not working. It's really only for escaping CC. That's the only reason that it's involved. One thing that I want to point out is that you'll notice my damage actually starts very slow at the beginning. Well, before I get into that, these guys with the bubble around them are really annoying because you have to pop the corpses while the corpse is already inside the bubble. You can't pop a corpse outside the bubble and have it run into the bubble to explode because the skeletons can't pass that barrier. They explode on the outside edge, and they don't actually do damage. Anyways, what was I saying? You'll see damage ramp up the longer I'm dealing the damage. So the first few ticks of damage might be, 2,000 to 5,000 damage, and then the next couple of ticks will be in the 10 to 15,000, and then the next few ticks will be, in the 20 to 30,000. And every once in a while, you'll see ticks up in the 60, 70, 80,000 range, and even more rare than that, you'll see a few ticks of over 1 million. The reason you might see a tick for over 1 million is because the shadow damage over time, it can't crit and it can't overpower. But Shadow Blight can, because it's not technically a damage over time, it's just a single instance of damage. So whenever Shadow Blight hits, and that can crit, and that's whenever you see those really high damage numbers. Whenever I've ramped it up to its max damage, and then it crits. Which, because shadow damage can't crit and it can't overpower, I didn't build around getting high crit chance or high crit damage. So my damage is a little bit more evened out. Every once in a while you'll see that sudden spike.
I'm not ready yet.
And see the first few hits, 1, 2, 3,000, 5,000, and then by the end it's hitting for 30,000, 40,000, 60,000. Just a few ticks later. That blue number, that was a Shadow Blight overpowering. Unfortunately, I hadn't ramped up the Shadow Blight damage at that point, so it was only about a 15,000 tick. But yeah, that's kind of how the damage works on this build. It starts low and then very quickly ramps up. There is a legendary item. I forget the name of it, but it's the one-hand weapon that every time you use Corpse Explosion, it uses up to 5 corpses at a time. And that Corpse Explosion gets bonus damage based on how many corpses it used. It also gets a little bit larger radius. I don't use that, and the reason is Corpse Explosion is a large amount of damage, but the real main damage source of this build is Shadow Blight. So what I want is, rather than one large instance of damage from Corpse Explosion, I want many smaller ones. It's better to shoot 5 corpses and get 5 rings of that blight on the ground, each doing their own damage, rather than one large blight that is actually only one instance of damage. Triggering Shadow Blight slower, a lot slower. And also, it doesn't generate corpses fast enough because whenever you use 5 individual explosions, each of those explosions is a chance to generate another corpse. Whereas just one explosion, you're just naturally going to be generating fewer corpses with fewer instances of the shadow damage. So it's better to use just the big one hand. Paradoxically, you'd think, I'm sorry, big two. You'd think that the small one-hand weapon that attacks quicker should be able to generate more corpses for you, but no, it's the large two-hand that attacks very slowly that generates more corpses and higher damage. see me taking a lot of poison damage here, and then just as I walk around, I suck up some blood orbs, and it immediately heals me back to full. Run in, apply my vulnerability, get the swing in to generate a single corpse, and then just spam away. And I've not really been in any kind of danger throughout this whole thing. Granted, this particular dungeon, the enemies in it are really great for this particular playstyle. I didn't actually plan it that way, but you can get things like your wraiths and your succubi and vampires that like to run away. A lot of these shadow-based builds might have trouble with it, but because we have the gloves that make Corpse Explosion chase after things, it's not a problem at all. You can just, rather than chase after them yourself, let them run away, and then just, you know, shoot a couple corpses that'll track them in that direction. Kill them that way. Takes care of that issue, because without those gloves, this really is a melee range build, where you kind of have to be up inside things. With the gloves, it makes it to where you can play at more of a range.
Are not ready yet.
This is a little bit annoying. Some of those corpses are tracking the little chain pillars that were summoned rather than the mob itself. You can't control where they go, but it doesn't matter. Those guys will figure it out eventually. And, you know, if we run out of corpses, we can always generate more. We've got Reap ready. In a really dire straits, we can use Blood Mist to generate a few. But I really never have any problems generating a corpse. Oh, and here's the boss. This boss is a little bit annoying because he likes to disappear and teleport somewhere else. So he just exits our pool of death. Also, you saw there, he leaves the miasma that blinds, and it disables any of your other abilities. I can't see where that pool is because of the darkness left by my own pools of life. So that's a little bit annoying. See, I couldn't see where that blindness was. It's just something you got to deal with a Shadow Blight based necro build, is that it's going to make your entire screen black pretty regularly. Blizzard has said that they're gonna fix it, but apparently it's not a super easy fix. The boss is gonna die here really soon, and then I'm gonna kind of mouse over all the different parts of this build. At this point, I actually did think my mic was on, and I began talking about the build. And it wasn't until I looked back at it, I was like, oh, well, for those last few minutes where I was actually talking about the build, my mic was off. So here we are doing a little voiceover. Yep. And the main thing that I changed since the guide that I made on this build was I changed out the aspect on this helmet to this one that gives us the bubble. And like I said before, this is a buffer. So when you're most vulnerable is at the very beginning of a fight, and what this does is that bubble will proc, and it'll give you 5 seconds of basically invincibility, provided you don't get like pulled or shoved out of the bubble, where you can generate your corpses and generate your blood orbs and get your damage or your damage mitigation layers up. By the time the bubble's gone, then you're nearly unkillable. Yeah, that's the main part of the build. I pointed out in the guide. We've got the 2 pieces that buff Shadow Blight. We've got the 2 pieces that work in conjunction to your Blight pulls things together, and your Bone Prism spawns a Blight. So, yeah. We've got this, just another damage layer. There's not really anything better. Yeah, and this that makes your corpses chase after stuff. It's a huge quality of life improvement. So that you're not having to chase after things and try to generate corpses while some mobs will kite you, which is really annoying. Yeah, those pants aren't absolutely necessary. You can do this build without those pants, but getting those pants kind of shoots your survivability through the roof. I was playing this. This is actually the last piece of the build that I found was those pants. So I did play this for quite a while without them, and it worked just fine. Yep. Here's all the skills. We alternate between Blight and Corpse Explosion, so we'll pop a few corpses and then use Blight to pull things back together. Corpses, Blight, corpses, Blight. We'll also alternate between Bone Prison and Corpse Tendrils. So we Bone Prison. When the vulnerability from that wears off, we use Corpse Tendrils. When the vulnerability of that wears off, then usually Bone Prison is off cooldown again, or everything's dead. And then of course we have the Blood Mist as our oh shit button. You know, if we get stuck or CC'd really hard, we can Blood Mist out of there when we need to. It also generates us a couple corpses, so as soon as it ends, we can be popping corpses and getting blood orbs again. We sacrifice everything. We get some extra shadow damage. We get, which one is this? I forgot. Increased damage to vulnerable enemies, which is great because we're always making things vulnerable, and we're getting increased health. The increased health is very important because the more base health we have, the more fortified we can get, and the bigger our barrier is going to be. Here's all the skills again. I'm going to kind of go over the passives. So this one's critical. All of our sources of damage have a chance to spawn a corpse. So the more instances of damage we can create, the more corpses we get. We kind of have an unlimited supply. Again, we can get corpses from Blood Mist, but really it's just for the escape. Bone Prison is just 1 point. It's not really to keep things in, although it can in some cases, particularly like loot goblins. You can trap them in it really easily. But it's just 1 point. We don't care about the life of it. We just care that it applies vulnerability and sucks things together. We get both of these because we're always using corpses. We have infinite essence to use Blight when we want, and we always have that damage buff because we're always using corpses. Here's the passive where you get damage mitigation to close enemies and extra damage to them, because I usually play this as sort of a melee build. I pull everything towards me into a big pit of death, and I keep them stunned and immobilized, and taking the shadow damage very close to me. There are a lot of enemies that it's actually difficult to keep away from you, so I pretty much never take the other passive that's for distant enemies. I always take the one for close enemies. We're also maxing out our shadow damage with those few shadow passives down there. Again, 1 point in Corpse Tendrils for the same reason as Bone Prison. We don't care about its damage, we just care that it applies vulnerability and pulls things together. We take both of these because they buff us when we don't have minions, which we're sacrificing our minions, so it's a pretty big buff. And of course, Shadow Blight is the crux of the entire build. Shadow Blight is the majority of our damage, and we want to make it happen as often as possible. We're taking the Wither tree and I believe it's the Blood Drinker tree. I forget. There are two Blood Paragon panels, and you can kind of check by the key passive in this, which one it is. But we get damage. Anything that buffs our damage when we get a Blood Orb, more Blood Orb healing. And that's basically it. We get a lot of extra life from that panel as well. The Wither panel, we take everything that buffs our shadow damage over time, and damage mitigation from enemies that are taking shadow damage. And there are a few nodes on here that also increase our life by a little bit, which is always super beneficial, because again, the larger our life pool, the bigger our fortify, the bigger our barrier. And then, of course, there's the basic panel where we take all the rare nodes and stuff like that. As far as the glyphs, they're really straightforward. Extra shadow damage over time, extra shadow damage, and this one's very important. Blood orbs fortify me. So I'm constantly creating and picking up blood orbs, so we're getting max fortify pretty much all the time. And that's it. That's a tier 35 dungeon. That was pretty much a breeze to get through. and a second breakdown of the build itself. I hope you enjoyed.